welcome to the next episode of BAC Channel with Mahesh Daas. Today we have an extraordinary pleasure of listening to famous architect, urbanist, educator, and thinker, provocateur, and an extraordinary human being, Daniel Libeskind. We have had a great conversation that will be a treat to listen to that spans the notions of origins, particularly his life story, which is extraordinarily powerful, and the kinds of connections that it has, and this kind of, shall we say, lines that run through his work that emanated from his origins, and how they informed his work, and how his work illuminates the world, and how it challenges our notions and conventions, and perhaps even makes us uncomfortable in the process of offering those perspectives, but altogether elevating the discourses, elevating our understanding of our world, and certainly ennobling what it is to be human in a very special way. And we talk about how his upbringing and his early childhood and life experiences have informed his work, and then how his work begins to inform and engage the public and the people and the individuals, and how his work across the world, around the globe, has been transforming various notions of architecture, for sure, but also the notions of memory, the notions of public, the notions of democracy, and all of those in a very powerful way through his work. So we are absolutely delighted and privileged and grateful for this conversation, and I certainly personally cherish this conversation and my association with him sporadically over 3 decades of time of knowing Daniel Libeskind. Well, thank you so much, Daniel. It is such a pleasure
Great pleasure to
see you again.
with you. Absolutely
Long time, and
fantastic.
thank you for accepting our invitation.
It's an honor. Thank you.
And it's always such a joy to see you, to interact with you, and what a gift, I think, gift to the world, your work.
You're very kind. You're very kind. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I think as I was just reminiscing, it was back in 1995 when you were in Berlin, when you were working on the Jewish Museum, that I reached out to you
Yes.
to invite you to the online reviews in 1995.
We hardly had a computer in our. Yes, fantastic.
And that was, I think, we were communicating by faxes at the time.
That's right. But it was a pioneering step, I have to say. Looking back at it, yes.
But a long ways we have come. I think your career trajectory has been incredible.
Thank you.
I wonder, and I wanted to maybe talk today about maybe notion of origins and where things originate. Or is there a point? Or is there some kind of continuum? I don't know. But I think when I look at your work and read your writings and looking at your life story and the trajectory, or stories and the trajectories, what I kept wondering, what are these origins and how are things connected? And they begin to find time and again those themes are present in your work, in your writings, and so on and so forth. So, let me start with the question of maybe a story that vividly struck me when I was reading your memoir, this beautiful memoir, Breaking Ground, and in which you talk about your mother. And of course, you talk about your mother being very important influence in your life. But the particular story was very important when she was, along with, I think your father was also at the same time in the Russian Gulag in 1942, if I'm not mistaken. And at the time the prison or the camp officer summons your mother and tries to disrespect, and she throws a bottle of ink. Tell us about the story.
Well, it's a story that was verified. Otherwise, you'd think it's a piece of fiction. Maybe my mother made it up. Couldn't somebody make up such a story? But she had a couple of friends who were survivors. She was in Siberia, in the most remote gulags. Just to imagine it, she said they had no shoes. They wore newspapers tied around their feet while being exploited. She was a seamstress sewing shirts, white silk shirts for the Russian general staff, for the generals. So it's a Dostoevsky moment. You see the poor exploited prisoners, mostly women, Polish, Jewish, engaged in that. So my mother went to the commandant. The commandant wears the uniform, has the gun at his hip, and a big portrait of Stalin behind him at a desk, that kind of bureaucratic desk of the autocrat. And she said, we, the women, we demand shoes. We can't work in the snow with. And he called her, oh, all of you women are all prostitutes. You're like the worst. And my mother picked up the inkwell and she threw it, and she missed him. It wound up, she told me, on the spot on the Stalin portrait just below the face. And she said he reached for the gun and then hesitated for a minute and put his hand back and he ejected her. The next day, they got something to wear on their feet. So my mother had the courage, she had a personality that was very strong. You can see that because to do that in Russia, you are basically committing suicide. You're going to be killed. Nobody speaks to authorities in any way. You just remain silent and hope to survive. But she had that kind of a will, and she had that kind of personality, which I think was connected to her background. She came from a very famous Hasidic family, venerated for many centuries, of scholars, of rabbis, of people who had faith. And so she had that kind of wisdom, I would call it. It's not something you can learn in school, or you cannot learn it from books, but you can somehow acquire it through your experience, and she did, certainly. A brave woman.
Now, you were not born at that time.
No, I was born after that. This was my father was a prisoner somewhere else. They did not know each other, my parents. They were in different prison camps. My father was on the Volga somewhere, where he also told me, a very interesting story. How did he survive? He said, I survived because of my handwriting. And I always tell this to my kids and others, make sure you have good handwriting, because when they were arrested en masse as Polish exile people who escaped from the Nazis, they crossed the River Bug, and they were, of course, immediately arrested by the Russians as foreigners and thrown into the prison camps. So he said there were thousands of people there arrested, and they had to fill a card for the KGB, or the NKVD as it was called, name, address, what did you do, sort of bureaucratic listing, who you are, a card. And collected all the cards. And my father said, at some point, the commandant of that camp called out Nachman Libeskind, who's not, and he said that if your name was ever called out, you were a target, you would die. So you should be always anonymous.
Right.
And they called his name, and my father said, in total trembling and fear, he went over, and the commandant said, are you Nachman Libeskind? He says, yes. Did you write this? He says, you will keep our records.
Wow.
And by keeping records, you could actually survive, because you did not have to go at 4 o'clock in the morning into the snow to with no hammer, with just a stone to break other stones. So yeah, it's stories like that give you a sense of fate, fatality, and destiny, and also accident.
Yeah, I guess his handwriting became the writing of destiny in a way.
It was.
Right.
His handwriting, and he had a beautiful handwriting.
Yeah.
And throughout his life, he was kind of a true artist in a way, who never had a chance to be an artist, because he had a hard life, wars, and we worked in a factory, but he had an amazing talent actually, and his handwriting revealed it. He wrote his story in a way of survival with that signature.
So on the one side, we have the beauty of the handwriting, the meticulousness of it. And the other side, we have the courage and the rebellious and challenge the status quo spirit.
I have to tell you, my mother worked in the sweatshops in New York. And, she was a seamstress. And the sweatshops, in the time when we came here, they were really awful. Yeah. They had a lot of immigrant women from all over, the world.
Dial back just a second to get there. So from the gulags,
we went back to Poland. We were then back to Poland to discover that nobody was left.
Yeah.
None of their families, nobody was left.
Including your extended family, right? Your own uncles.
My father counted 85 or 87 members.
Yeah.
Brothers, sisters, uncles, grandparents. Nobody, no survivors.
Oh my God.
It's a typical story. So anyway, when we emigrated to America, my parents had a tough life. They worked in factories and so on. But my mother told me she organized a strike because she said the work was very, demanding. Sweat. There was no air conditioning. There was nothing. Just heat in the middle of the summer. And she said we need to have soap, to wash ourselves after work. And they did not provide it. So I said, so who did you strike against? She said, my idea, and I got all the women to support, was the strike against the employers and against the unions. And I said, why? And I said, why? She says, because both of them were not protecting our rights.
Wow.
So, she was a kind of an anarchist, or I don't know what you would call her. She was a free spirit and
absolutely
able to sort of just conform.
How do you see that in yourself?
I don't know. I don't think I could live up to my parents' experiences because they were far smarter and far wiser, for sure. Even though they were not formally educated at all. My father left school at grade 3. That was the end of his schooling. But he was a voracious reader. Both my parents were great readers, great thinkers. And I often thought, imagine if they had the chance. Yeah. How would the world be reflected in their experience? So, that's unfortunately the story of the late 20th century, that the abyss of those era where so many lives were destroyed and murdered and.
And you were, all of 15 years old when you came here?
I was 13 when
13
I came to America, yes. Yes.
How was that time?
Oh, my God. I thought I found another promised land. I mean, America was a kind of a dream. No one knows what America really is. It's a fantasy. But when we came here, we were in shock in a sense that we couldn't believe how beautiful the people of America were. We lived in the Bronx. We moved in different housing blocks and so on. But our greatest impression was how good the American people were. Yeah. Because we could compare them to other people that we had met in our lives. And so our experience was a typical, I would say, immigrant experience to America, without language, without any support, really, without jobs for my parents, just the ability or attempt to survive and get educated and try to start another life. Yeah, but that was kind of an inspiring moment when I think back of it.
The interesting thing is you arrived in the ship named Constitution.
That's right. Oh, my God.
Right? And the irony, I'm not just irony, I think the serendipity of it, I should say, is amazing. So you arrive, you're from a family of Holocaust survivors, and I know your mother said it's not surviving. It just really strengthened them, and then with all the strength of those experiences, and then you arrive in Constitution, and you eventually end up master planning Ground Zero.
Yeah, how strange. It's true. I still remember the moment. Really, I guess every immigrant remembers the moment of arrival somehow. Yes. And I remember that we were woken up early in the morning on the ship It was all immigrants.
Yeah.
And my mother said, get up, you're going to see New York. And we stood on the deck, and you see the skyline of New York, but
Yeah.
it's kind of unfathomable
Yeah.
in a way, something beyond what a human being can actually grasp, sort of intellectually, because it's so fantastic and so what beyond a dream. And that moment, and by the way, the ship sailed right on the left side was the Statue of Liberty. It was one of the last ships that actually brought immigrants because later it was cheaper to fly. So, seeing that statue, which looked to me so enormous, maybe because I was shorter and smaller and there was a lot of people crowding, but, that perspective upwards, like a kind of, like from an Eisenstein, film, of Potemkin, this massive statue with a torch. I didn't even know the Emma Lazarus poem, "Give me your poor, you're tired," that was actually inscribed on its pedestal. But yeah, it was all part of a kind of,
So you really landed more or less at the footsteps of
Yes.
Statue of Liberty.
Yes, yes,
And then grew up in Bronx.
yes. In the Bronx.
And there's, of course, the story of how you went into music and the accordion player.
That's right.
Virtuoso accordion player at it, along with Itzhak Perlman
Yeah.
in violin. Right?
Yes.
Tell us about, so you had, that was your first love,
Yes.
wasn't it?
I started really in music, and my destiny as an architect belongs to the accordion, because had I played the piano, I would have never been an architect.
Right.
But I played accordion because my parents were in Poland were too scared to bring the piano through the courtyard of our hostile neighbors. Very anti-Semitic era, very painful to live there. So my parents said, we've got you in a piano in a suitcase, which turned out to be an accordion. Yeah. What did I know? It was.
You bought it.
Yeah,
You
and
wanted to
absolutely. And I was kind of destined to play that instrument.
And so that really took you to, you went to pretty prestigious places to play it.
Oh, yes. I played in Town Hall in New York. I played with famous musicians, with Ashkenazi, with, amazing classical music. I was an oddity playing classical music with famous classical musicians on the cello, on the piano, on the violin, playing the accordion, and my own transcriptions of Bach or Baroque music. But actually, somebody showed me an old review from somewhere, and really I appear at the top of the review because of the oddness of it. Everybody knows a little bit of classical music played by famous, but to see a very short kid, because I was much shorter then, with a keyboard that was made 3.5 octaves long, which I could hardly carry on my body, playing, it's kind of fireworks.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I loved the instrument, of course.
Yeah, that's amazing. And of course, you talk about how you moved from that to really become an architect.
Yeah.
Because of your mother's advice.
Yeah.
In a way, right? Or insistence, perhaps.
Well, she was a wise person. You could never. She was not somebody. She was a free thinker. She never asked me what my grades were. She never asked me what I was doing in school. She never worried about it. She was a free thinker. So she once in a off comment said, you really should study architecture more than art, because I was definitely going to study art.
Yeah.
She said, and she was, I think, doing something with a carp or a fish, and she said, in this way you can catch two fish with one hook.
Yes.
That if you study architecture, you can also study art. But if you study art, you will not be an architect. Yeah. So it was a wise piece of advice, I'd say.
Wonderful, and how it guided you.
It did.
In your life. So so I think one more thing I wanted to touch upon it, and maybe perhaps we can explore the connections between all of these serendipitous things. So when you started in architecture at Cooper Union, and you're commuting from your home, right? Yeah. Basically, you are going from your home, and you talk about the table at your home with the T-square, and there is no straight edge to the table. And I found that very curious because that seems to have influenced you in very interesting ways.
Well, absolutely. In retrospect, I think that geometry is product of social conditions. Geometry is not just a product of an idealized world. It's a product of where you live, what access you have. So, we had a small apartment, my sister, my parents, we lived in a 2-room apartment with a small kitchen. After dinner, you clean up the kitchen, you do the dishes. And the table that my parents had bought was a kind of ungainly formica table that had large round edges. And, after dinner, I had to do my homework. So, and I had Bauhaus teachers. The homework was usually, perfect rendering or drafting of bricks with a gap, and a perspective or something like that.
Yeah.
Very challenging. But, when you have the T-square and you're sliding it around this formica table, you don't know at what point you're off by just a 0.001 off the perfect 90-degree angle.
Right.
Because, you don't know where that curve really starts. And at some point I realized the liberty that it gives you not to pay attention to the right angle.
Yeah.
That there are 365 other
Right.
there are many other ways you could draw those lines. But really, had I been a little bit richer, had I had a drafting table, had I been, I probably would have never stumbled upon the fact that the straight line is a product of economics.
Yeah. Straight line is a product of economics. That's beautiful.
Thank you.
That's quite extraordinary because straight line is just one among an extraordinary number of lines.
Absolutely.
And line has a certain theme in your work as well, isn't it?
Of course.
Tell us, in what way do you see and connect them then?
Well, every line has a soul.
Yeah.
Every
line
form
has a soul.
and every form has a soul.
Yeah.
So you have to follow it. You're not in charge of it. It tells you it takes you somewhere. A line is something kind of amazing because it takes you where you have never been. And so, whatever the line is, whether the line is a graphic line, whether the line is a vector of orientation, a sense of where you are, where you have been. So it's there's more to line than even the rhizome or even the thinkers that thought about, how does life come together. More than, we can actually conceive because it's a mystical thing.
Yeah.
The line.
And the word line also has a lineage connected to it.
Absolutely. Lineage and origin, of course, belongs to the lineage. And it's also a kind of charisma because it's a proclamation of something the minute you are going somewhere.
I suppose then connected to that is a notion of right angle. And you write about that and you've talked about it. So I wonder, please tell me about your thoughts about right angle and how that connects with a line.
I love the right angle, Who doesn't? When Le Corbusier said that the minute man, he didn't say woman, but the minute a man relinquishes the right angle, the world will fall apart. I always thought, he was a mystic of some sort. And I thought a lot about it. That his apocalyptic vision is kind of an authoritarian one.
Yeah.
Because had it been a woman, had it been somebody who's crippled, had it been somebody who's not able to walk, straight, quote unquote, or in the right way, they would not have belonged in that horizon of the perfect man. So I always attracted to the margin of that, who is not taken into that line, who is not taken, and of course. There are so many other vulnerabilities in life and in geometry that one should embrace. The ones that, who was it? I think it was Donizetti, the great composer. Somebody said to him, "What is your favorite piece of music?"
Yeah.
And he said, if you have children, your favorite child is going to be the crippled one. And I have so many crippled children. He said that about his work.
Wow.
So, what is your favorite work of music?
Right.
I was going to choose the most vulnerable, the most failing, the most needy. I think it was beautiful.
That is beautiful.
And it's also about geometry.
Yeah.
Because we are ruled
Yeah.
often not by just dictators and the obvious authoritarians around us, but ruled by the grammar of our orientation, which to a large extent has been determined by power.
Right.
And by totalitarians back from Assyrian and Babylonian eras. The origin of writing itself, you can say, is to record murder, record who works, who doesn't work. I mean, the earliest tablets tell us not about the beauty of nature, or they tell us how many workers are needed to perform the following jobs. So, the minute we enter that line of inquiry, we see so many interesting things that we can learn from.
The line of inquiry.
Yeah.
And so to further talk about that, and to talk about the notion of line and right angle in your work. And I think it is one thing to talk about it as geometry and in a material manifestation of it, but it's another thing to talk about the metaphysical connotation of those things. Yeah. I wonder how your work has evolved around those themes.
It's hard for me to I don't think of myself in that way, but you just follow sort of what you're doing and you try to do your best, in different circumstances. But certainly I was always fascinated in drawing.
Yeah.
And, that was something I fell in love with. I have no idea why, but it's something that attracts me to this day.
Yeah.
I have different tools. We have different things. We have different means, different tasks.
Yeah.
But there's something revelatory about drawing. And if I think it was Paul Valéry who said something interesting. He said, back around 1910, just before, around World War I, he said, when people forget the metaphysics of what it takes to draw a square or a circle, that'll be the end of civilization. And I often look, in the computer, you can produce so quickly, a million circles, a million squares. So the whole metaphysical sense of where did it all come from? Why did we get stuck with these things? There are so many creative civilizations in Asia and Africa, elsewhere, who don't have it and have thrived for millennia with a complete different mindset about where they are, how they are oriented in the world.
Yeah. Once again, I think the conditions under which your architectural education definitely unfolded were the conditions of your home.
Yes.
And the drafting table.
Yes, sure.
Perhaps.
If I didn't have that kitchen table, I would not be an architect.
The kitchen table.
The kitchen table.
That's wonderful. And so how do you reckon those influences continue to play a role? Is it a desire to reconnect with that moment?
Well, I know many architects who come from well-off backgrounds. They're born into backgrounds where they have an uncle who needs a house, or they have, I always thought, what does it mean for working people to do architecture? What kind of architecture comes from people who work just to survive? What would their architecture look like? It would be certainly different. And I connected to my background because I think, first of all, I lived in the first housing project in the United States. First public housing project in the Bronx.
Okay.
It was built in the 1920s. It was featured in a number of films in the 30s, The Garment Jungle. The first project built by unions, left-wing groups, to say that working people in these factories should have housing.
Right.
And I lived in the building number 1, which was later, of course, raised because it had no elevators, no air conditioning. But I always thought, living in that building, which we moved to when we immigrated to New York, to the Bronx, was amazing because it had no air conditioning, it had no amenities of anything. It had just the fire escapes where people sat, in the hot July nights. But there was a vibrant sense of community.
Right.
It did not really depend on the material luxury of where they lived. Right. They had small, apartments, crowded, Not as badly as in the 1920s or 19th century, but still it was not a kind of quote model way of living, and yet produced fantastically interesting people. By the way, in my entire life, I never met an architect. I never met a doctor. I never met an engineer or a lawyer. Who did I meet? All the people around me were people who work, many in the manual world,
Right.
manual workers. So that's the world I come from.
Yeah.
And I, live a very privileged life. And I often think, what are we doing to really make sure that architecture is not really for that 1%, that appears sometimes in the magazines or, on the media, but the regular people. And that's why I'm doing now the 2 projects in New York, public housing.
Yeah.
Public housing in Brooklyn, public housing in Long Island for elderly people, for the homeless. And my idea is to show that you don't need to build luxury housing to show that you're a good architect.
Right.
You could build something very modest,
Yeah.
for a low budget that makes a huge difference to people.
Yes.
And that is also something about architecture that is the key. Because without that social sense of what is architecture for, is it only for the people who can afford those extravagant places, or is it for a democratic society?
Yeah, no, I think it's Danielle. I think it makes a lot of sense to me that you were born in a homeless shelter,
That's right.
and you grew up in the first public housing in the country, and you are currently actually doing public housing that serves people of New York, and that seems to me again a circle.
It is. In a strange way, it is. It is because you are who you have been. You don't just reinvent yourself and become somebody else. You're not produced by yourself.
Yeah.
You have parents, you have family, you have a background, you have a culture.
Yeah.
So yes, some people try to erase it, or some people just think they can just be self-made. But we're not self-made.
I think when we think about your work, and starting with, let's say, Jewish Museum, in terms of the built work, obviously you did a lot of work prior to that. That was foundational.
Totally.
Right? And then you started your building buildings career with the Jewish Museum. And then you've done an extraordinary set of works now, hundreds of buildings all over the world.
Yes.
Right? And of all types as well. Although, of course, most prominent have been the museums, but that does not mean, there are other kinds of buildings too. And, when, of course, I often hear criticism of people, and people either love or hate Daniel Libeskind's work. I love it. And I always found it curious to find these origins and about what does this personally mean to the architect who is designing these. And I can make the connections about where you emerged from, and the trajectory of your life, your experiences, your lineage, if you will, the line of what happened. All of those begin to find meaning in your work, right? Sometimes it is very evident or obvious. Sometimes it is not so obvious, right? So in the Jewish Museum, it would be good to hear about how that thought actually originated to do that competition in the first place. What motivated you?
It was not motivating. I got a letter one day. I was living in Milan, in Italy, with my family, little kids. And I got a letter that came to me, I don't know from whom, said there is the competition. You have to inscribe yourself by this date if you want to participate. Of course, with the Italian mail, the letter was 3 months too late. That's the Italian mail system. So the day I received it, the next day was that's another one of these destined moments.
Yeah.
The next day was the closure of the competition. So since I didn't respond, Nina, my wife and my partner now, called the number, and he said, this letter was 3 months in the mail. Can Mr. Libeskind arrive late by one day and I arrived late by one day to Berlin, and I inscribed myself into this competition. But I had really no idea. It was like, like a letter that came from me from somewhere. Who sent me that letter? I have no idea. It was a form letter from the building department of the city of Berlin. I never thought of doing a competition in my life.
Right.
I never looked at competitions. I was not interested in doing competitions. So I said, it's such, and this project, this is not a competition. This is a letter for something important. At that time, it was not called the Jewish Museum. It was a competition for the Berlin Museum with what they call the Jewish Department. So basically a reconstruction of the large museum of Berlin with some recognition that something had happened in Germany to destroy 6 million people. So I signed into it, and I started working on the project in Milan. And I had some friends, architects, Milanese architects, who came and they saw what I was doing, and they said, "You're ruining your career because this is a chance to do, but you're not doing a building. This is not a building. This is your only chance. You're in a company. You could actually, since I never designed a building, this is actually interesting. I had such great teachers, John Haydock, Peter Eisenman, Richard Meyer, great, fantastic people. But they allowed me to graduate without a single building because I tell you why. I always, was kind of a rebel, stupid, but I was a rebel because I thought, if I don't have a program politically, if I don't have a social need for a building, if I don't have a budget, why am I designing a housing project, a school, a hospital? I'm not going to design it. I'm going to do something else. And so I, wove my way through my schooling, and my teachers were very forgiving because they let me get away. So I never designed, I never designed a building. So the Jewish Museum was my very first building. And then people said, now you're ruining your chance because that's not what a staircase looks like. That's not how a window should look like. That's not, a plan doesn't look like that. It's too long. You should make it more compact. You're transgressing the city limit. The site ends here, but you went out by several meters, on the tip of the building. But, sometimes ignorance is a blessing.
Yes.
Because when you don't know something,
yes,
you discover things that maybe others who already know too much don't see.
Yeah.
So I remember when I was on the site, and there were a lot of architects from around the world. There were 250 architects or something in the competition. Somebody came over to me. He saw somebody a little bit lost on that because I had no camera. I didn't want to have a camera. I was just walking in a kind of mist of history, thinking what transpired on this site in the middle of Berlin. And somebody came over to me. He was very kind. Later I met him. And he said, the first thing you have to know about this competition is the fire regulations, because Berlin has very strong fire regulations. You have to position the staircases in the following way. Otherwise, you'll be eliminated. Then the second person said, do you know anything about the requirement of toilets in Germany? It's a very important, they'll check this first.
Right.
To make a long story short, I knew nothing about it. And in a way, I was completely innocent. It's like a child. It was childish. I did what I believed in.
Yeah.
And when the telephone rang to inform me that I had won this competition, I didn't also realize what that meant because it meant nothing. It's usually, a ticket to oblivion when you win. It's a political move. Nobody had any intentions of building this building.
Yeah.
When I came to Berlin with my wife, somebody said, "So why are you here?" I said, "Well, we won this competition." And he said, "For what?"
That's right.
This is a public. No, you're crazy. And everybody said you should leave Berlin. You get a contact architect.
Yeah.
Go live on Santa Monica, have fun, do whatever you were doing, research. But I asked my wife Nina at that point. I said, "Will you become my partner?" And she said to me, "How can I be your partner? I've never been in an architect's office in my life." And I said, "Same to me. I was only for 2 days." So, that's kind of an adventure of life. And sometimes when I think back on it, it's really the things that are least likely to happen.
Yeah.
happen, and the thing most likely to happen don't.
You never worked in an architect's office. Even midpoint of your career, right? At that time,
never.
you were actually at Cranbrook, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken.
Yes.
You had already been there. You were, I think, 43 years old, something like that. And you worked for a couple days in whose office?
For Richard Meyer.
For Richard Meyer. You hated it. Tell me about why you didn't continue.
You know, I was hired. I got a pretty good salary.
Yeah.
I worked for 2 days, and then the third day I was at home. Kind of, and Nina said, like, "Why are you not going to work?"
Yeah.
And I said, "I have to make an excuse. I have to call and say I'm ill." She said, "Not go, why? But you're not ill. You're okay." I said, "I just can't enter that office." And she said, "Why?" I said, "Because it's so boring.
Yeah.
I see the backs of all these people. I see the solitude and the quietness, and I see the hierarchy, and it's not the way I want to spend my time."
Yeah.
So at the end of the week, I said, "Sorry, I cannot, I cannot do this," and I never tried it again.
Yeah.
That was it, and I never thought again ever working in that environment. And luckily for me, I don't work in that environment.
Right.
It's a very different. I mean, we have an office. We have to be able to, financially pay for people working so hard, but it doesn't have that feeling of conformity. It's more kind of an organized, anarchic process where there's no hierarchy visible. There is hierarchy of knowledge, of age, but there is kind of equal access to creativity.
Yeah.
So yeah, I did something rather different.
Rather different. Yeah. I mean, it's amazing to me that, the whole trajectory of you completed your studies and you were working as an academician at really, what is it, 20 plus years?
Yes.
In academia.
It's a whole other life, yes.
And making extraordinary drawings and installations.
Yes.
Which were then in Venice Biennale at that time. What is it, 1984 or something like that?
Yes, yeah.
And then you're confronted with or provided this. I mean, maybe it's a destiny, right? That you were given this opportunity to now say, well, you hated all of that, but now what are you going to do with the building?
It's true. It's true. It was it's a strange life takes you on a strange adventure if you're open to it,
right?
Because it's not realistic. You have to also have somebody who you love and who's tolerant of the kind of gaps and abysses in your life which don't have any kind of an aporia. You don't know what is happening and why you're doing it and what's going to happen to you. But if you suspend your disbelief, you can sometimes do something that you didn't even expect yourself to do. And I'll tell you the example in the Jewish Museum. I was called by the technical department of the Senate of Berlin. And they, it was an anonymous competition. That's the only reason I won. Because if they had asked for criteria, giving you a portfolio, what have you built before? Zero, nothing. I didn't have a building in my portfolio, nothing.
Right.
So because it was completely anonymous, they didn't, they had just a number.
Yeah.
And my number was 6,000,001.
Yeah.
And I put that down. And so I was selected. And then the Senate technical office called me and they said, he doesn't know anything. So they said they put a empty drawing on the board and it said, "Mr. Libeskind, draw us the foundation of the building." And the building is a very complex geometry.
Yeah.
And I said, "This is a trick question."
Yeah.
Because that's why they're asking me. So I took my pen and I drew a perfect rectangle. Because I knew that if I drew the form, I would be making a mistake.
Okay.
And they said, "Yes, you know a lot about foundations, Mr. Daas." And I said, "My God, I passed the test because," and of course, it's a bathtub, in the water of Berlin. You have to create something. But anyway, the basement is a shaped basement. But anyway, there's so many anecdotes. And, I often feel that my biggest problem now is I've acquired too much experience. You begin to know what windows are. You begin to know how to make foundations. You begin to know, what a compact plan is and so on. And that's a disadvantage.
Yeah.
Because you sort of don't question it. You just do it.
Yeah.
It's almost automatic.
You're trained.
You're trained. And when I started the Jewish Museum, people said, you better get some real professional architects because
Right.
you don't know anything how to put a building together. I said, I don't want a single professional. I don't want people who know how to make windows.
Yeah.
So I hired just young architects who never built anything.
Ha!
Because I said, I don't want to make windows that have already been made.
Right.
I don't want to have doors that were already designed. I want to invent. Maybe it was naive, but it worked.
Yeah, it was a rebellion.
It was a
I would
rebellion.
say that's where I connect with your mother's.
It was a rebellion.
Throwing the ink on Stalin's portrait, kind of rebellion.
It is ultimate.
I think it's
But she put her life at risk. I put much less at risk.
right. I mean,
But you're right.
And now you are one of the most prominent architects in the world.
Well, it's
Destiny.
it's a strange course.
Strange course, but I think clearly you've made your choices by really authentically being who you have been.
I think too many people think architecture is a very elitist field, but I think anybody who has the passion for making something can be an architect.
Yeah.
And I think one day maybe it will be a time when everybody will be an architect.
Yeah.
And if you do a lot of work in advanced technology and AI and so on, but I'm sure there will be one day where we won't need any architects because everybody will be an architect.
Did you read my next book already? Because that is actually one of the stories is in the next book I know about. One of the chapters is called Architecture Without Architects.
Beautiful. Yeah.
The idea is at some point in the future, it is going to be illegal for humans to practice architecture. And so it is all AI is doing it. It's a dystopian story, but
it's a story. Yeah, I understand it. I
it connects
understand
with
it.
what you're saying.
But it could be also not just dystopian.
Yeah.
I think empowering everybody to do something.
Yeah.
If everybody was a poet, everyone had we not need so-called poets.
Right.
Everyone would be.
Absolutely.
So that's.
I mean, that's so well stated, and I think that's the mission of the BAC, which inspires me too, which is that we need to open doors to anyone who aspires to be a designer.
Totally.
In whatever areas, and bring them in, as opposed to saying, well, prove that already you know.
Yes.
And then you come in here, we'll just simply let you wander and give you the degree. That's not what we are. Right? So we open the doors and we bring students who might not know anything. And other than that, perhaps I want to be a designer of something.
Yeah, have an idea, have an image, have a dream.
Yeah, an image. In that sense, it connects with your experience beautifully.
Totally.
As well. So I think, that's why I say the conventions of architecture, the conventions of, defining how we dwell, who we are, all of those are challenged by your work. When I experience your work, I'm just so inspired, uplifted, challenged in a ways of conventions. And so when I go through that, it is almost a meditative process where everything becomes aware. You need to be constantly aware of yourself, not take myself for granted. Unlike any other building where I wander and I'm like, I know what I'm doing, and whereas in your work, there is a connection of myself to be aware.
Yeah.
And also the sense of growth that one experiences. As you move through it, then you say there are gestures, pointing things, the lines that lead to
It's
things.
very eloquently said because, architecture, we take it for granted. And all architecture looks pretty much the same for the last thousands of years, with small variations. And I've always wondered, why is architecture so slow to change? We have science, we have, the most amazing discipline. We can go into, the black holes. We can go deep into the DNA. We have so much capacity. But when it comes to architecture, we still sleep in that cubicle with that bed around the wall, with the small window or the large window. It's a wonder how immune architecture is to change.
Yeah.
It's and I always wonder, why is it so hard to just change a position of a window?
Yeah.
And you change a position and everybody says, no, you can't do it. It's not right. You're violating some principle. It doesn't really work, And I think that's probably the grammar of life is produced by the subconscious or unconscious
Yes.
presence to the built environment, which is everything, including all the parks and all the natural reserves, are also pre-planned already in our notion of the world.
Yes.
So we are sort of in a closed system. It's hard to get out to see, that remember the diagram, I don't remember, 16th century, where there are all the spheres of the world, and there is a head of a man popping out trying to look, what does the world look like from the outside? It's a very famous diagram. I forgot the beautiful illustrator. But to see really who are we? If we look at ourselves from a point of view of someone else,
Right.
what do we look like?
Yeah.
And how limited are we?
That's a wonderful reflection. How limited are we? I think that's where the childlike curiosity, questioning everything, and as you said in your book also, in many times you said, I think it is your father or somebody who told you, be wary of the authority, or always be careful.
Well, you have to understand, I grew up under communism.
Yeah.
As an 11-year-old, you understand the fear. You understand the silence of people on the streets. You understand that everything looks normal, but inside there is a gray conformity, because you can't step out of the line. You can't just say something. Even as a kid, you know it.
Yeah.
In school.
Yeah.
And once you have been subjected to totalitarian thinking, and many people have not been, luckily, but once you are very aware of the dangers to democracy that are, everywhere. Yeah. Don't speak, don't say it, don't dress like that, don't be yourself, don't step out of the line, conform, get the job, go climb the ladder. No, all those things. But, people, I always thought, no totalitarian system ever expects that someone's going to be born who's not going to think that way. Right? I mean, that's the breakdown of all the authoritarian systems. Somebody's going to be born who says, I don't accept it like that. It doesn't look right to me.
Like your mother.
Like my mother, yeah. And, I guess she had no choice, because probably she didn't think of dying. She just did what she, at that impulsive moment.
Right.
And had she been shot, probably she would not even know about it. It would have been just part of that story.
Yeah, if that happened, we wouldn't be sitting here and we'd be having this conversation.
That's for sure. Too. But what example, my daughter, who's an artist, created an installation work where she had the portraits of Stalin, many of them. It was an exhibition called The Death of the Father. And it was also political, about our time here too.
Right.
And she had the inkwells, and she had the audience with it was a fantastic.
I didn't know that. That's
great. It was a fantastic interactive kind of experience of what does the death of the father really mean.
Wow.
Yeah.
Powerful.
Powerful.
Again, the question of out of the line, you talk repeatedly about in authoritarian regimes, people should stay in line, but not out of the line. And again, I think your buildings definitely, and your drawings beautifully demonstrate how to break that mold, right? I mean, that, I think, do not fall in line.
Yeah, I rejected this idea of formalism, of doing things just as the next step of another ism. Yeah. And try to experience yourself, what you're doing. Yeah. And it takes you into a region.
Right. And that's where I connect with the origin of trying to break the line, and, your mother's moment of that rebellion, and constantly breaking that line.
The line is even great. The breakage is not just even personal. If you think of the two events, I think, that have changed the world forever, there are two to me, that the world will never be the same again, and very few people kind of really look into it. It's the Holocaust. It's a murder. It's a murder of a people. Yeah. Let's eliminate these people. Yeah. With these. That's and Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Japan. Those two events to me are kind of redefine the world, what the world is. And we have to think hard about what the reality, where are we now after these events? Because it's such a fundamental change. And my mother, it may be just a small kind of a footnote in a way of the catastrophe of a certain way of thinking.
Yeah.
Because when you look at the Holocaust, the perpetrators of the Holocaust, I once looked at the Wannsee Conference. The Wannsee Conference was where all the government officials signed the declaration saying, we will murder all the Jews. They signed it. Who were they? Most of them PhDs from the finest universities of Germany. They were young. They were all in their 30s. They were not old men. They were young, vibrant, very well educated, like people graduating from Yale, Harvard, the top schools, signing, we will exterminate these people from. And I often think, our illusions about, education, about where we live, about who is around us, what is taking place? And architecture can ask those questions. I think it can.
Absolutely.
Definitely. But because architecture, so much of it is a matter of habit.
Yeah.
And we are not aware of it. We always have the door handle. We always have that particular grasp. But sometimes you stumble.
Yeah.
And then there is something else that is revealed.
Absolutely.
Architecture is a great system of conformity, basically, because you start with a plan. Yeah. And a plan is already, something that has danger in it. Any plan. Remember the 5-year plans of all, of dictators. In 5 years, we're going to do this. In 5 years, we're going to do that. Some of the candidates in our electoral, say, in 5 years, I will do this. In 5 years. But I'm not against planning, but how do you succeed with a plan that has a democratic value to it?
Right.
And by the way, at ground zero, my thought was the following when I won the competition to be the master planner, that most master plans are never realized.
Right.
When you really look at the history of master planning, you realize that all the beautiful plans of all the greatest have never been realized. They're in archives, they're in beautiful museums. And I wondered, how is it that most master plans are not realized? Well, because in 5 years, everything will change, so nothing will be realized because reality has changed. Yeah. So the plan is going to be, vulnerable. Right. It will not be. So I thought, how do I design something that has the full meaning of what I want to do, but can actually be realized in a practical way? And I'm glad I had many supporters. But that was my thought. Yeah. Let me do something that actually is practical enough to gain possibility of delivering to the people of New York or to the world, a place that has that memory and also has the potential to be developed. And so that was my kind of governing thought.
Wonderful.
Not just make a nice drawing and try to build it, which is unlikely, but try to make a drawing that when you, in 5 years or 7 years or 10 years, will look pretty much like the drawing, given all the compromises necessary, the tensions, the politics, the discord, the disagreement. How do you rally people around something that they say, this works, this can be built, this is practical enough, this is worthy. Yeah. So it taught me a lot about how to get something done which historically has very little chance to be accomplished.
Right. And I think, in your projects that you saw, particularly the public projects, what enormous odds you faced, and yet you persevered.
I have to tell you, when I was at the Ground Zero competition, we only were a few people in we have a small office. We don't have some of the corporations where they have 100 experts just on traffic or, 50 experts just on technology of, building the foundations. Right. We knew very little. But I wasn't interested. I was interested in the people who perished. Yeah. What happens to their souls? Where are they? What can you do not to do something which protects the sacredness of a site which no one declared sacred? Yeah. It was just a piece of real estate in New York. Yeah. So I started with a very different point of view, which was not about the density and all the complexity of the site, but what happens here where people perished? What should you do? And my first decision was, don't build on it. Yeah. Which is a kind of a simple-minded thing, but so you can't build where people perished. Yeah. It's not allowed in my world, in anybody's world. Right. So out of the 16 acres, half of the site you can't build on. That's just about it. Right. So then do something that fulfills all the requirements, but preserves that. And it's interesting that no one declared the site sacred.
Yeah.
It's no one said you should not be allowed to build it. It's real estate. It's worth billions of dollars every square, inch.
Right.
So you do whatever, But again, if you're lucky, and you have supporters, and you have the good luck.
Absolutely. And Daniel, I think, the power is, you talk about staying with the truth, and that helps you persevere, right, against all odds.
It's true. You don't rely just on yourself. Yeah. That most people think that you, the person doing it, is in charge. Right. I'm the opposite. Right. You have to rely on something much bigger than yourself, very different from yourself, and you have to be a believer. You can't be just a transactionalist, transacting in some operations, and too much in architecture is drawn from just the belief that you yourself are going to do it, because you're not doing it. It's something else that does it, and call it whatever you want. You can call it. Society, the divine, history, reality. Yeah. You can call it by different names, but most of us think that reality is what we can control. Yeah. But I think just the opposite. Reality is what we cannot control. Yeah. What is not controlled by us is what is real.
Wow, powerful. And I'd like to connect that to again the theme of the notion of origin, original, and then how everything we do seems to be a quest to make sense of our own life.
It's simultaneous, because, whatever is the world is also our revelation of what it is. Whatever we reveal reveals something about ourselves. Yeah. We can't get away from it. Right. So, anything you discover is also a recovery or discovery or cover for who you are. And of course, it's a simultaneous process. Yeah. It's not just on that side out there or that side in here. It's absolutely we are in the world, and we can't help it.
Interestingly, also I see another theme in your work, and one that is reflected in the three machines at the Biennale, the reading, writing, memory machine, and then later on also in the Jewish Museum case, other cases, there is a certain theme of something that. Notion of writing, printing, reading, all of these. So there is a textual, the notion of the text, right? The kind of post-structuralist notion also, but I think it's more personal as I see it.
Well, I think in a way, life is a story that starts somewhere. We don't know where it started because it didn't start with us. It started somewhere. Right. And it's going somewhere, and it's not going to end with us either. Right. It's going somewhere. So I'm not a believer in the good or bad apocalypse. Some people believe, the world is going to come to an end, and some people believe it's not going to come to an end. Right. That's the two simple thing. But it depends. What happens depends on us. What that ending, whether there's a good ending or a bad ending. Right. It depends on what we do. So I think you're right that it's kind of an interactive process. And I remember reading. I was very impressed, and it's one of the things I never forgot in reading the Discourse on Method by Descartes, which is considered by many the first insight into true rationality, the binary system, the 0 and the 1. The computer, the scientific method, the mathematics of it. And he, in his meditation, he says somewhere, and now that I've reached this point, I don't even have a body. And I never forgot that at some point he was so deep into this world of ours and the world into the future that he felt he was not there. Yeah. And I often thought about this, and of course this is part of phenomenology. Yeah. How that we cannot. We live through a lot of self-amputation. Every piece of technology is a self-amputation of our abilities. You give a piece of your arm to that technology, a piece of your eye to that technology, a piece of your brain to that technology. So the self-amputation is leading to a certain kind of existence, but it's still a bodily existence. Yeah. It's still, you cannot amputate everything, because then you would not be there. So it's interesting how the technology in the information era has also affected how we think of the future. And of course, your work is very deeply part of that.
Thank you. That is a good segue to wanted to talk about artificial intelligence.
Well, you're the expert.
That's the topic of the day. I might be, I might have spent a little time thinking about it, but I think I'm really curious about what are your thoughts from where you sit. How are you making sense of these developments?
It's a very deep, I've thought about it much less than you, because you've written books and you're an expert on it. But I think a lot of our intelligence is artificial already. It has been artificial from the very beginning of time. It's what Derrida wrote about translation when he said, there's a bad. People said, what kind of translation it is. And he said, our own speech is already a translation.
Yes.
We're not original. We're already translating what has been. So we are also already translators. We are not there at the origin. So I feel that much of the humanity is on a kind of on an automatic pilot. Already from the beginning of time, we've been set in a certain way. Why have we been set in that way? What is the event that sent us into that clearing?
Right. Are we always destined to do this?
Yes.
These kinds of technologies.
Totally. So there's, of course, fantastic potential there.
Yeah.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And, of course, there are dangers and opportunities.
Right.
Like in all technology.
Yeah. Are you using any of the AI technologies? In even a simple day-to-day way, or ChatGPT, or
I've used.
Midjourney, or
I have to
anything?
tell you the truth.
Yeah.
I used it. I said, I want. I'm getting this amazing honor here in Boston, so I'm gonna ask ChatGPT about my speech. I said who I am, what I want to talk about, and I kid you not, ChatGPT produced an incredible speech. It started by, "Dear graduates, I'm so happy to be here." And I read it and I showed it to Nina. I said, "I can't look at this." He said, "Oh my God, you could use it." And I said, "No, I can't. I've got to do something different. I've got to say something of my own." But the potential is absolutely there.
Wow.
And it was incredible. And I was kind of, I wasn't humiliated, but I thought, like, what can I say which the ChatGPT would not say, which is not in the data?
Right. Right.
Because ChatGPT, of course, all of the AI is based on data.
Right.
And bigger the data, the more it can take. So I always think of what has no data?
Yeah.
What is not recorded? Who's not recorded? I just was reading that 2 billion people in the world are not recorded. They don't exist. They don't have citizenships. They don't have birth certificates. They are not on any census.
Yeah.
They don't belong to anybody. They can't go to a hospital and claim care. They don't appear under protection of any government. 2 billion people are living, in a world that has no document and no data. So, of course, there's a sweep to get everything into data, but there might be also the counter. The world. What is that? Shakespeare. Not mine own fears, nor the prophetic soul of the wide world. Not mine own fears, nor the prophetic soul of the wide world. It's a fantastic sonnet.
Yeah.
Not mine own fears, not the prophetic soul of the wide world, dreaming of things to come.
Wonderful.
Yeah, I remembered it.
Got it.
Dreaming of things to come.
That is beautiful.
It's so, and so we don't know. There is a world soul.
Yeah.
Dreaming of things to come.
Yeah.
And it has our fears in it.
Right.
And not even my own fears, but the fears of the world. It's a lot to think about, because and also to incorporate to one's work.
It's interesting, Daniel. I think what you said about dream the world that never existed, perhaps. And I think in the data, so whether we are trained, human beings, in a way, I say that we are trained just as artificial intelligence, neural nets are trained as well. And if we are conforming ourselves to our training alone, then we are repeating the tropes and themes of the past. And that's not going to lead to anything productive or healthy. But the question is, how do you break that? And can you break that without knowing? Can you break that from knowing? I think those are questions.
Yeah.
But also, I don't know if you know that in Midjourney, there is, in fact, in Daniel Libeskind style. If you say, do something, whatever, and then say in Daniel Libeskind style, it does it.
I'm sure.
I'll show you
I'm sure.
later, but
I'm
your
sure.
work has been encoded
Yeah.
into the data
Yeah. Yeah.
and into this artificial intelligence world that will perpetually, move on, go on. So it knows certain things.
But that's an interesting thing, because you can have a simulacrum, you can have something that appears to be the same, but without a soul.
Yes.
And so, how do we know?
Yes.
How do we know the mannequin from the human? How do we know the what appears to be completely human?
Yes.
But has no. How do we see the soul?
Yes.
And I'm a believer in the soul. I think as long as there's a soul, and nobody has been able to find it, right?
Yes.
No, Descartes was looking in some gland or somewhere for the soul. He even thought that dogs are computers. He thought they were not like humans. They are automatic. They're programmed. They have no soul. Right. We have a soul, but the dog does not have a soul.
Yeah.
But it's those ancient notions, which appear everywhere in the world at some point.
Yeah.
They appear, whether it's in India, whether it's in Greece, whether it's in China, they appear kind of a breakthrough in the ecumenic age, that there is a soul, that the world is not just an arbitrary set of chaotic data, but there is something that is driven that is important.
Absolutely, right.
Yeah.
It connects with what you said about Descartes' notion of disembodied knowledge. In a way, artificial intelligence is disembodied intelligence. And that is a dangerous thing in the sense that when there is no body, suddenly you lose point of view.
Exactly.
AI has no point of view.
No.
Because it has no body.
Exactly.
And unless, we give it a body as a robot or whatever, wherever it is embodied, then I think it has a point of view and existence in the world. Thus, it can begin to learn from that point of view, as we humans and life forms do. Yeah. Right? I mean, that in that sense, embodiment is so important.
It is. It is. And I'm saying if we succeed in giving all of ourselves over to a simulacrum, which is possible that people will, but we will sell our soul. And that's an old story. It's in Faust.
Yeah.
You can sell your soul.
Right.
Some people have sold their soul. All those signatories of Wannsee Conference who seal, they sold their souls. And you don't have to be a believer in hell, but they sold their souls.
Absolutely. And that is inhuman.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there is and in my book I write about being unhuman is not as insidious as being inhuman.
Yeah, exactly.
Because all of these are created in the image of being human.
That's right. And I think that's the connection. Who are we?
Yeah.
Are we just, a more advanced set of animals? Yeah. What are we? We'll find out.
Yeah, we'll find out.
We already found out some bad things about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And your buildings make sure that we are reminded of that memory. And the memories that are lost of invisible people and exterminated.
Because memory is not really, to me, a extra dimension of architecture. It's the core. That most people study the topography of the context.
Right.
They study the site. They study what's there, pollution, and what are the environmental conditions. How sustainable are they? But to me, you've got to go to a deeper ground, which is the ground of memory. That's where is the sustainability of that memory? Where is the ground of that memory?
Yeah.
And I think if you build out of that ground, you see that very often the physical ground is the groundless game of chance,
right?
Rather than a true embodiment of what you're doing in a place that means something to you.
Right. Beautifully stated. And I think, no one has done, to my knowledge, really, you're one of the most prominent people working at the intersection of these notions of memory, of really reading the plays and connecting with those themes of the plays. and bringing them out in ways that are unconventional.
Because memory is also not in the book. I discovered, you think that we know what memory is.
Yes.
We think we don't know the future, but we don't know the past either.
Beautifully stated. I really cherish this conversation,
Likewise.
Danielle. It's so special.
Thank you.
And I really appreciate your taking time from your extraordinary global, practice and career. And we are looking forward to celebrating.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you.